The recent resurgence of vigilantism has seen government and law enforcement scrambling to quell public lynching of people suspected of criminality. But some commentators say there is a thin line between vigilantism versus community activism, and they point a finger towards the lack of law and order and proper governance, which they say perpetuates acts of vigilantism by crime-weary communities. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered with me, Alderin Simpier, here on SABC 3. The lack of visible and active policing in certain communities has resulted in masses organizing themselves to address the issue of crime, giving rise to organizations such as Operation Tutula and Put South Africa First. In his newsletter this week, President Cyril Ramaphosa acknowledges community frustrations by the apparent inability of the police to deal with crimes. The president says they are also re-establishing community policing forums across the country and urge communities to work with the police by reporting suspected acts of criminality. Our question for you this evening is, why have some communities lost so much faith in the police? Remember to join this discussion on our social media platforms using our Twitter handle @UnfilteredSABC, or go to Facebook and just search for SABC Unfiltered. Let's welcome our guests this evening. We are joined by Lizette Lancaster, who is a manager of Crime and Justice Information Hub at the Institute for Security Studies, or the ISS Africa. Also, we're joined by Zianda Stierman, author of the book which explores the state of policing, titled Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa. And we also welcome the spokesperson of the police at Landamats, who's joining us for this conversation. But before we continue with that discussion, let's just quickly take a listen to this following clip by the Police Minister, Bheki Cele.
Killed here before Elvis, who makes almost 6 people that died, and the same human being, the same body. So I'm really worried. We have brought 12 detectives that are stationed here, not starting only with those 6 and Elvis, but the last quarter of last year, which is October, November, December, 11 people were killed here. Only 3 people have been picked up and arrested. We are simply saying to the police that is unacceptable. Hence, we are putting top group of detectives. And please, when you ask us next time, ask about the matter. I appreciate that your emphasis there. But as the police, we are dealing with all the matters and the cases that are there, including the mob, the mob killing, the vigilantism, and those that were killed before that we haven't found. But to come back to that question, we haven't picked anybody for those people that were killed, including Elvis, but we are beginning to make the inroads in terms of understanding what happened. And in not a very distant future, we will be able to crack the case.
And let's start off that conversation by going to where the minister was speaking from in Diepsloot. We're going to start off the conversation by speaking to the police spokesperson, Atlanta Matu, who's joining us for this conversation. Atlanta, good evening and welcome to the show. First of all, looking into what happened in Diepsloot, and also now there is a police task team or unit that has been set up that will be in the area for 3 months. To do what over 3 months?
Well, a very good evening to you, Aldrin, and to your viewers. I think firstly it's important to highlight that what happened in Diepsloot is not vigilantism. It's pure acts of criminality. The majority of the residents of Diepsloot were raising genuine concerns on a lack of, rightly said by yourself, police visibility and a lack of resources, the escalating crime levels in that area. But as I've indicated, this protest was hijacked by those who took part in acts of violence. So there was no acts of vigilantism according to our investigation. So if I can just give you an update, as the South African Police Service, we have managed to stabilize the situation in Diepsloot, and as such, the situation remains calm. Police remain on high alert. You are well aware that we have our tactical response teams on the ground. As mentioned by yourself, we have a dedicated team of detectives who are working closely with communities, but who are also working around the clock to normalize and stabilize the situation. So we are continuing with our crime combating and high visibility operations in this area where we are supporting the local police stations. So our operations include, your overnight operations where we raid the local taverns, conducting stop and searches as well. But if I can indicate, this is not only an intervention that was conducted only now. We've got Ukayamula operations that are taking place weekly in some of these areas.
But now you have a task team of detectives and police officers in Diepsloot. So had those residents not taken to the streets, if those 7 murders didn't occur, would you have had such a team there?
Well, if I can put things into perspective, right? Diepsloot is one of the police stations that falls under the top 30 crime weight police stations in the province. Crime weight, meaning we have the 17 reported crimes, such as your common assault, your assault GBH, reported in this particular police station. So we have a lot of domestic violence cases that are reported. Like I've indicated, there has been a number of interventions. So we are not only starting now to intervene in Diepsloot. We've had your Okaimala operations that are taking place there almost every weekly. We are conducting.
But you've never had a task team there, Atlanta. That's the point that I'm trying to get to. And also for the mere fact that you had community members who took to the streets, that spurred on having entire ministers, MECs, as well as the premier of the province going to the township. Would that task team have been deployed there if those community members didn't take to the streets? Why must it first get that far?
Well, what is happening in Diepsloot and what happened is a serious concern. And as the minister and the National Commissioner indicated, strengthening community police relations is one area that we are focusing on. We do concede, seeing what has happened in Diepsloot, that there are challenges in terms of our community police relations. Hence the ministerial endeavors that we have been conducting. Hence the daily visits that the minister and the National Commissioner and all other key stakeholders have been conducting on a daily basis to ensure that firstly, we listen to the residents of this area.
So Atlanta, because we need to conclude on this particular one. I know that you said that you can only speak on this issue in relation to Diepsloot, but the other part of it is that as the police spokesperson, are you willing to admit that operations such as Operation Ukaimulao has therefore failed? And that's the reason why you had community members in Diepsloot taking to the streets.
We are not failing as an organization. Every week, Okaimulao is reporting a great progress in the programs that they are undertaking, your operations, midnight operations. On a weekly basis, Okaimulao is being conducted on a Thursday, on a Saturday, and there are great successes that we continue to report. Yes, Diepsloot, there are challenges. We do concede that we may have dropped the ball there, but we are intervening. We have realized our mistakes, and we are acting to ensure that we've normalized and stabilized the situation. But most importantly, what the residents there were crying about or raising concern is the lack of resources, the lack of police visibility, the escalating crime levels, hence the immediate intervention from both the Minister and the National Commissioner.
Thank you so much for your time. That is Atlanta Mato, who's the spokesperson for the police. When we come back, we'll speak to Lizette Lancaster as well as Yanda Steerman, just to try and make sense of the state of policing in the country and why we're seeing more and more community members taking matters into their own hands, if not taking to the streets. Good evening, you're still watching Unfiltered with me, Alderin Simpier, as we look at the state of policing in the country and why it is that so many communities have lost faith in the police. We're joined by Lizette Lancaster, who is a manager of a Crime and Justice Information Hub at the Institute for Security Studies, or the ISS Africa. We're also joined by Zianda Stirman, who is an author of the book which explores the state of policing, titled Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa. And Zianda, I'm going to start off with you now. Just listening into what Atlanta had to say there, that number one, it's not vigilantism, and also they've dropped the ball in Diepsloot. However, though, they have operations such as Operation Ukai Mulao. Then where are we failing?
Good evening, Aldrin, and you know, I think it was really interesting listening to what the police spokesperson had to say, because I think there was really a reluctance on her part to really connect the fact that yes, this is a case of vigilantism, but also a case of criminality. We've really seen organizations like Dudula or formations such as them, possibly starting from an innocuous type of place, where community members are trying to sort of address grievances, whether right or wrong, and then escalating to the criminality that we've now seen in Diepsloot and in other parts of the country where Dudula has taken hold. So I think it's, to me, there's no real benefit to trying to pass out the difference between vigilantism and criminality. It is all criminal and illegal and honestly quite dangerous behavior. I think what that also speaks to is, the gap that forms when the police aren't there or aren't visible, or the communities don't trust them and decide that they will be their own policing force. And that's precisely what we then see with this violence that we've seen meted out against hundreds of people, honestly, at this point.
Yeah. And the interesting thing for me about this, Zianda, is that where, for instance, the police fail, we know that people will find other means to almost plug that hole. For people who are part of a middle class, upper middle class as well, who have the money, they would go the security route and get private security on board. But for communities like Diepsloot, for instance, what else is available to you?
That's precisely correct. We saw with the testimony from hundreds of community members at the Khayelitsha Commission, for example, speaking about how they turn to taxi drivers, for example, or other civic formations who they trust more than the police, even though those groups are not accountable to them in the way that police are meant to be. And again, I think this speaks to this very static sort of process that some police stations or police officers see themselves in playing a role with operations like, Ukai Mulao or Buya Mthethwa that really, unfortunately, don't have long-lasting impact on the ground. If you're, sort of shopping for short-term solutions, those operations are shock and awe, and, yes, they show the police out on the street, but it doesn't, unfortunately, inculcate a culture where those police officers are on the street every day, being visible, but also connecting with communities.
Yeah. And Lizette, thank you so much for joining us this evening as well. Listening to what the minister had to say, actually it was the new police commissioner when they were in Diepsloot, the issue around resources. There were 50 vehicles in Diepsloot, and now that number has dwindled down to 6 vehicles that the area was using, that populated area of Diepsloot. What impact does this lack of resources then have on the ability of the police officers now to do what they're supposed to do according to their employment contract?
Thank you. Yes, the lack of resources in these high-density, underserviced communities are particularly problematic. We know that policing resources are not spread evenly across the country. We know that these communities are particularly underserviced, not just by policing, but by many other services by the government. So you are, from that footage you are showing areas that are in dire need for development, upliftment, and such. And what is happening in these communities, and I know this area in Diepsloot, and specifically the area that has been quite problematic, is that problem has been persistent since the start of Diepsloot. This area, as you can see, have got high informal areas, a mix of businesses and residential, and that the communities are not trusted the police are not trusted in these communities simply because since the establishment of Diepsloot Police Station less than a decade ago, there's been a lot of culture problems in terms of how policing is done, feelings that, you need to pay the police in order to get things done by the police. There's just this trust deficit. So you can put the vehicles there, and those are very important. This area is highly problematic. So I'm shocked to hear, that the number of vehicles that are there. But not just that, it's about how policing is taking place. Stop and searches is not building community trust. The fact remains that there are extortion rackets and extortion groups that we have seen last week that are not being investigated and are not being arrested. Instead, low-hanging fruit is the so-called irregular or undocumented foreign-born migrants that we see there that are being stopped and searched, instead of dealing with the groups that go around asking for protection money from these very people that you see there that are not protected by the police.
And interesting,
so
Lizette,
there's a lot of issues there.
Quickly, Lizette, on the point that you raise now on these protection fees, and the interesting bit about it is that we're not only seeing these in communities like Diepsloot, but even within business itself, where you have infrastructure that's being built. For instance, maybe a tender has been issued, and then you'd hear about this extortion where these groups would demand money from these companies to continue doing their work.
Exactly. We've heard the president speaking out about this. We know that for the so-called construction mafia, we have seen task teams being formed. But these groups, these so-called task teams, the one for Diepsloot, need to work with the task teams for each of the provinces. These protection rackets, whether they are the construction mafia, in colloquial terms, that are operational in all our major cities, focusing not only on government tenders, but also on private tenders. And these protection groups under the, whether they are part of the doula or not, these are rife. We are seeing just this mushrooming of vigilante type groups of all sorts, and most of them end up asking for protection money. And this is where the real problem comes in. We are not seeing the police talking about these groups. We are not seeing residents being protected against these groups. Yet, we see randomly people being asked for documents by the police. That's not building trust. The real culprits are not the ones that are being searched, stopped, and detected. We're sitting in this country of rising murder rates, and we are sitting with dwindling detection rates of murder of only around 15% now, I think, according to the last annual report.
So when we come back, let's have a conversation then about what should be happening now. The president has spoken about the re-establishment of CPFs. There's also a conversation that's happening amongst political organizations speaking about the work that should be done by street committees like we saw during the early 90s. Is that something that's going to help protect our communities? That conversation when we come back. Good evening. In conversation with Lizette Lancaster as well as Yanda Stierman. Before we conclude and have our closing remarks, let's just quickly look at some of the tweets that you sent through. Vincent says that they are nowhere to be found in times of life-threatening situations. And this one from NN Mampane saying that the South African Police Service must do more to rebuild confidence in all law enforcement agencies to combat crime and recreate safer communities. Salute the establishments of street committees must be vigorously pursued in all communities. And the last one from Okau says, Aldrin, how can I expect protection from the people whom most of the time are stretching their source of income by doing crime? They forgot that they've vowed in the police academy. They've become like politicians. Most of them are in the taxi industry and some owning taverns. And Zianda, that's another bit about this conversation as well that we rarely actually have about how, for instance, police themselves are actually involved in some of these businesses that need protection.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an incredibly complicated and messy situation that we're basically in. I think that many of us know that, police officers are very much like average citizens where, they're not paid enormous amounts of money, not to say that they're badly paid, but they're not paid enormous amounts of money, and like anybody else, would like to supplement their income. Unfortunately, in some cases, that leads to them abusing their position of authority, as law enforcement officers and the access they have, as police officers especially. So we're really dealing with a situation where they're compounding issues on top of each other. Yeah. And in this case where, you have impunity amongst the police who feel like they can do pretty much anything given their gun and their badge.
Oh, and Zianda, just in conclusion then, the president speaking about the re-establishing of CPFs, what's your understanding of the role of CPFs? Also, considering the type of environment that the country currently finds itself in, where there is, of course, this tension and this battle for a lack of resources. However, though, this tension keeps on growing, and also the level of unemployment that we're currently seeing. And I'm cautioning against the idea of, or perhaps the risk that we run, where we could find communities being at each other's throats.
Yeah, look, I think that CPF shouldn't be thought of as a kind of catch-all or solve-all, right? They have a very, very specific sort of function in that they're meant to be relations between the police and the communities that they serve. One of the reasons why the president has said re-establishing CPFs is that many of them have fallen apart because of political interference, where local politicians stack them, with vested interests or with people that who agree with them or don't agree with them, etc. And that's really where you kind of find CPFs as they are. So I don't think that we need to, imagine that establishing a CPF or even just a street committee is going to solve everything and anything to do with building trust with community. It's only one aspect of a much broader issue that, like you said, includes economic growth, includes addressing inequality, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And Lizette, your closing remarks and the take on what the president is speaking about, the re-establishing of CPFs. And the other thing about it, Lizette, is looking at what happened during the July unrest, for instance, where the president was actually praising communities for, quote, protecting their assets. And this is where we find ourselves also.
Yes, look, it is important that we celebrate community activisms, community groups. The difference is that perpetrators need to be handed over to the police. There need to be that trust relationship. Taking the law into one's own hands make one a criminal too, and that's where the problem of vigilantism lie. The problem, what we saw in July that was very apparent very quickly, is that there was such a breakdown between communities and the police that communication couldn't flow. There wasn't sufficient information about where to get resources, how to guide communities, to assist them in protection and protecting themselves. So we saw the levels of, in that vacuum of guidance and leadership, we saw these incidents of vigilantism, for instance, and just sheer criminality that we saw in places like Phoenix. So what we need is a CPF to understand and recommit to their mandates. Their mandates are not there to protect the police, because often now we see that CPFs, where they are functional, see themselves as behind that thin blue line, behind, being part of the police and being the ones that now become the guardians of the police almost. Yeah. We need people that are help establish those relationships with the police.
Thank you so much.
The police, lastly, need to understand, lastly, just that the police need to understand that they need to see each and every member as part of community relations, not just, those dealing with CPS.
Lizette, thank you so much for your time. Lizette Lancaster as well as Yanda Steerman. Earlier on, we were joined by Atlanta Mate as well, spokesperson for the police. And thank you so much for choosing Unfiltered this evening on SABC 3.